Well, good evening once again. It's a time of the year when the budget is announced and the government has the opportunity to make a strong, powerful statement about its policy directions and its plans. But this time, it's different. It's in a period where the economy is in probably a greater crisis than many of us realize. It's at a time when our sovereign debt is just a shade above junk level, and one slip, like say in the fiscal deficit, it goes too high as a percentage of GDP and we could be declared or rated, downgraded to junk. And that has repercussions which run right through the economy. Interest rates get high, it's difficult to borrow. It's a crisis which is very difficult to get out of. So the first thing that this government had to do was to make sure that its fiscal deficit was seen by the world to be back under control, and it passed that hurdle. Or so it seems, but everybody's going to be looking in detail at the numbers tomorrow and day after and for the next month and see if they really do add up to 4.8% next year and 5.2% of GDP for last year. But that's just the first step. The world will also be looking at what reform path that India is, and to some extent the budget solved the first part but didn't really give very much confidence from all the reactions we've had globally on what the next steps are going to be. Well, in the next an hour or so, we're going to look at how's the world going to view India now. So far in the last 18 months, the world has frankly lost interest in India. If any of you believe in the signals from Davos, nobody talked about India in Davos. China is still the favorite. Indonesia is coming up. In fact, the BRIC countries are becoming passé. And unfortunately, India was one of those BRIC countries. So to look at the global picture, we have nobody better. We couldn't get a better person than Ruchir Sharma, who is from Morgan Stanley and has some 30, 40, 50 billion dollars under him investing. And you don't invest enough in India, but I don't blame you. And also an author of a very award-winning book in a number of countries, America, England, called Breakout Nations, which all of you should watch. And we've got Raghuram, Rajan, Chief Economic Advisor, who also comes with a global perspective to this, to running the Indian economy, and actually wrote the economic survey, which you also thought was well written.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
You're actually saying nice things once.
To start with, yeah.
But just very quickly, before we get into the facts and figures, will the world see this budget as changing anything, that India has got back its momentum, that something is happening? How will the world view us after today?
Well, unfortunately, the initial verdict is not quite good, because I think that most people had higher expectations out of it, that India has a history of reforming only when it has its back to the wall. That's a consistent pattern that this country has followed since 1980, a crisis at the beginning of each decade, and then you get a reform push. And since September, we were seeing the right noises in terms of, and some right policy action which took place on the part of this government. But now I think that this budget speech today, unfortunately, hasn't gone down well with the global investor community. And that's reflected in the way stock prices, the exchange rate behaved in a somewhat impulsive manner today. But that's the sort of reaction which is coming out, that this is not what they wanted to see. They wanted to see something much more dramatic on reforms. And on the fiscal side also, I think a lot of the assumptions are being torn apart when people are analyzing this budget.
Looking at the fine print. But tell us about this every 10 years and you're back to the wall. What's this? You talked about a 10-year cycle.
Yeah.
I've referred to it. I've cheated a bit of your analysis. Just explain that to us. Every 10 years there's a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at India, ever since it's started opening up its economy back in 1980, starting with 1981, when we went in for a very large IMF loan. In fact, at that point in time, it was the largest loan that any country had ever taken from the IMF. We were facing a balance of payments problem because we had such a disastrous 1970s. 1991, again, we had the meltdown and the balance of payments crisis, which I think we are all familiar with.
Right. 2001, that's the big reform.
Yeah. That's right. In 2001, 2002, we were suffering from the global recession, which is that in the post-TMT bubble, as that burst, India's growth rate dropped dramatically, in fact, to 3 to 4% in those couple of years. And there was a lot of concern about what we need to do to get India's growth back up to at least 5-6%, which then was considered
And the
normal.
NDA did, each one of these you're saying was followed by reform.
Yes, that's right. Each one of them, that's what got India back on the track. In the end, what India does is that it follows the global economic cycle very, very closely. But what these reform measures did was to put India back on track on each single instance. And the expectation was similarly building up that following the macroeconomic environment of last year, where so many of us were concerned about the way India was going, we saw some stabilization in the deteriorating sentiment beginning September, when a whole bunch of policy initiatives were announced for the first time. And the budget was seen in that continuum. And I think that the reaction we're seeing today is the fact that we didn't see enough of that loaded on today.
Right. Would you agree with what Ruchir is saying on 2 points? One is that we are in this 10-year cycle crisis, that this crisis is almost as bad, if not as bad, as 2001, 91 and 81. And was the government aware of that? And that globally people are looking at India with some lack of interest now?
Well, first, I wouldn't characterize the situation we are in as a crisis. I would say it's very difficult, but we're certainly nowhere near a crisis. Even on the foreign sort of investment fund or the front, or the current account deficit front, we have substantial reserves. So I won't go to the
reserves are a very strong point. We have nearly 300
we have
billion.
300 billion covers our current account deficit 3 times. But that's not. I don't think we want to debate that issue. The key issue for reforms is, are there reforms you could do which would up the growth rate tremendously in the short run? And my sense is much of what needs to be done is implementation rather than a fresh new set of reforms. Clearly that would help. I mean, if you look at manufacturing, there are lots of things that can be done to encourage manufacturing over the medium term. And some of those reforms will help. But my sense is, in the short run, getting us back to 7-8% growth, what's keeping us back is not that we have illiberal policies here or there. It's the fact that we need better implementation such that we can grow some of these sectors that are currently sort of stalled.
But Raghuram, that's something that people have been saying for years, that you've got to have better implementation. How do you do that? I mean, if we don't change certain structural issues, like we have a large public sector which is inefficiently run. We've been saying we've got to have better efficiency in state-run electricity boards. They used to say that in 1985, and they're still waiting for that, still running at 50% capacity. So how do you change? That sounds like something, a dream.
Well, no, that's where you have incremental reforms, the reforms that don't set hearts and minds afire, but that actually slowly make change things around.
And you think there was some happening?
For example, I mean, we've had reforms in Delhi in the electricity, in the electricity distribution. Yeah. Now you've got power in most parts of South Delhi all the time, and people don't comment on the fact that things have changed.
Right.
But let me.
But is it too slow, too incremental compared to the rest of us shooting along? And I wanted to ask.
This is where I want to. I mean, India's growth thus far hasn't, by any stretch of imagination, fallen behind the growth of other fast growers. The one country we keep comparing ourselves with is, of course, China, and we are certainly growing slower than China, but we're growing with democracy. If we could sort of run roughshod, and I don't advocate that at all.
Not at all, yeah.
We could possibly add a percentage point or two, but we could also go, terribly fast in the opposite direction.
In fact,